In September 1939, Britain entered a war it could not physically sustain on its own soil. The British Isles produced only a fraction of the food, fuel, and raw materials required to support their population and their armed forces. Before a single large land battle had been fought, the outcome of the war already depended on whether ships could continue to cross the Atlantic in sufficient numbers. This was not a dramatic realization. It was an institutional memory carried forward from the First World War, when unrestricted submarine warfare had brought Britain within weeks of collapse. The foundational assumption on both sides was straightforward. Control of maritime supply would determine strategic survival. What differed was how each side believed that control could be achieved. For Germany, the problem was structural. The Kriegsmarine could not challenge the Royal Navy in a decisive surface engagement. German naval planners therefore revived a familiar logic. Commerce destruction could achieve strategic results without fleet parity. If enough merchant ships were sunk, Britain would be starved of resources, industrial production would falter, and political pressure would force a negotiated peace. This assumption was not radical. It was grounded in recent history and reinforced by arithmetic. Britain imported over half its food and most of its oil. Merchant shipping losses did not need to be total. They merely needed to exceed replacement. The submarine was the enabling technology for this strategy. German U-boats were relatively inexpensive, difficult to detect, and capable of operating far from home waters. In theory, they could impose disproportionate costs on an adversary dependent on global trade. The expectation was that submarines would operate individually or in loose coordination, exploiting surprise and stealth to attack lightly defended shipping lanes. On the Allied side, the assumption was equally clear, but operationally incomplete. British planners understood that shipping losses had to be reduced below a critical threshold. What they did not yet possess in 1939 was a fully integrated method for doing so across the vast expanse of the Atlantic. Convoys had proven effective in 1917, but peacetime navies had allowed anti-submarine warfare doctrine to atrophy. Escort numbers were limited, air cover was short-ranged, and coordination between naval commands was uneven. Both sides entered the war believing time favored them. German leadership believed that early pressure would force Britain out before the United States could intervene decisively. Submarine production, while constrained, was expected to ramp up as the war progressed. Each additional U-boat promised incremental leverage over shipping lanes that Britain could not easily abandon. British leadership believed that losses would be painful but manageable until industrial mobilization and external support could compensate. There was confidence, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, that German submarine operations would remain tactically successful but strategically containable. This mutual confidence masked a deeper uncertainty. Neither side fully understood how information, detection, and decision-making would scale in a prolonged maritime contest. Early operations appeared to validate German assumptions. In the first months of the war, U-boats achieved notable success against poorly escorted merchant traffic. Individual submarines exploited gaps in patrol coverage, attacked independently, and withdrew with relative impunity. Merchant captains often sailed alone or in small groups, increasing vulnerability. Losses mounted, particularly in the approaches to the British Isles. Yet these early successes also revealed a limitation. Individual submarines could sink ships, but finding targets across an ocean remained inefficient. The Atlantic was vast, and a single U-boat's field of perception was narrow. Submarines relied heavily on chance encounters or limited intelligence cues. As traffic patterns shifted and escorts increased near coastal waters, opportunities declined. It was in response to this inefficiency that German Naval Command formalized the Wolfpack concept. Rather than acting alone, submarines would patrol assigned areas and report sightings. When a convoy was detected, nearby U-boats would be summoned to converge for coordinated night attacks on the surface, overwhelming escorts through numbers and confusion. The Wolfpack was not merely a tactical adjustment, it was an institutional bet. It assumed reliable long-range communications, centralized command coordination, and the ability to concentrate force faster than the enemy could react. It also assumed that convoys, once found, could not easily evade or suppress attacking submarines before damage was done. This assumption made sense in 1940. Allied detection capabilities were limited, particularly in the mid-Atlantic gap beyond the range of land-based aircraft. Radar was immature, sonar effectiveness varied with conditions, and escort vessels were few. Convoys were slow, predictable, and constrained by their weakest ships. From the German perspective, the ocean still appeared permissive. However, embedded within the Wolfpack concept was a vulnerability that was not immediately obvious. Coordination required communication, and communication created signatures. Radio transmissions, while encrypted, could be detected, analyzed, and eventually exploited. The Wolfpack traded stealth for mass, and in doing so, lengthened the submarine's exposure to counter-detection. On the Allied side, the convoy system represented an equally consequential assumption. Concentrating merchant ships into organized groups accepted higher local risk in exchange for reduced overall losses. Convoys were not intended to eliminate sinkings, they were intended to manage them. The belief was that escorted shipping, even if occasionally penetrated, would suffer fewer losses than dispersed traffic. Yet in 1939 and 1940, this belief was not universally accepted. Some merchant captains resisted convoy discipline, fearing that concentration made them more visible. Escort commanders worried about insufficient ships to protect every convoy effectively. There was also an implicit assumption that submarines could not be decisively countered at sea, only mitigated. Thus, both sides entered the Battle of the Atlantic with strategies that were internally coherent but incomplete. Germany believed that submarines could impose cumulative strategic pressure faster than the Allies could adapt. The Allies believed that losses could be absorbed long enough for material superiority to assert itself. What neither side fully appreciated at the outset was that this contest would be decided less by tonnage sunk or ships built than by information. Detection ranges, response times, coordination efficiency, and institutional learning would gradually outweigh individual tactical encounters. By 1941, the Atlantic was no longer simply a hunting ground. It was becoming a contested information environment. Radio signals, patrol patterns, and convoy routing were beginning to interact in ways that neither pre-war doctrine had anticipated. The original assumption that submarines could operate freely in a vast and under-policed ocean was beginning to erode. By 1942, that assumption would stop being true. By the beginning of 1941, the Battle of the Atlantic had settled into what both sides believed was a sustainable operational pattern. The underlying assumption of act I had hardened into doctrine. Germany would wage a campaign of maritime attrition using submarines coordinated through centralized command, while the Allies would attempt to limit losses through convoying, localized escort, and gradual improvement in defensive techniques. Each system appeared rational in isolation. The critical question was how they functioned under sustained pressure. The German system rested on centralization. U-boat operations were controlled from shore-based headquarters, most notably the Befehlshaber der Unterseeboot, or BDU. Submarines at sea were not expected to operate autonomously at the strategic level. Instead, they acted as sensors and executors within a broader command network. When a U-boat sighted a convoy, It was expected to report contact immediately by radio. Headquarters would then calculate convoy speed, heading, and projected track, and direct other submarines in the area to converge. This process reflected a deliberate trade-off. Individual initiative was subordinated to massed effect. A single submarine attacking alone might sink one or two ships. A coordinated Wolfpack attack could overwhelm escorts, exploit night surface tactics, and inflict losses at a scale believed to be strategically decisive. Technically, the system relied on several assumptions. First, that radio communications could be conducted securely enough to avoid enemy exploitation. Second, that submarines could maneuver into attack positions faster than convoys could escape or reorganize. Third, that escort forces lacked the sensors, coordination, or endurance to suppress multiple attackers simultaneously. The Wolfpack doctrine also depended on geography. The Mid-Atlantic Gap, beyond the range of Allied land-based aircraft, was central to German planning. In this zone, submarines could operate with reduced risk of aerial detection, and convoys could not rely on continuous air cover. The Atlantic scale was not merely a challenge, it was a feature the German system intended to exploit. However, the Wolfpack's effectiveness depended on a predictable enemy. Convoys moved slowly and adhered to relatively fixed routes dictated by navigational constraints, port capacities, and escort availability. This predictability made centralized tracking feasible. The German command system was designed to compress the decision cycle: detect, concentrate, attack. The Allied system, by contrast, was decentralized by necessity rather than design. Convoy defense was not governed by a single unified doctrine at the war's outset. Responsibility was fragmented across national navies, regional commands, and overlapping jurisdictions. Escort groups were often assembled ad hoc, using whatever vessels were available. Many escorts were not purpose-built anti-submarine ships but converted trawlers, destroyers with limited endurance, or older vessels lacking modern sensors. The core of the Allied approach was risk management. By grouping merchant ships into convoys, the Allies accepted that submarines would find them more easily. The countervailing assumption was that escorts could reduce the effectiveness of attacks by forcing submarines to submerge, disrupting firing solutions, and counterattacking after contact. This system prioritized aggregate survival over individual ship safety. A convoy that lost 2 ships out of 40 was considered a success compared to 40 ships sailing independently and losing far more. The logic was statistical, not tactical. Information flow within the Allied system was initially slow and compartmentalized. Escorts relied on visual sightings, limited range sonar, and intermittent intelligence updates. Coordination between surface escorts and aircraft was inconsistent, particularly in areas where air cover was sporadic or absent. Merchant captains were trained to maintain station and course discipline rather than maneuver independently, further reinforcing predictability. Yet within this imperfect system lay latent advantages. Convoys created a framework within which improvements could be integrated incrementally. New sensors, tactics, and command procedures could be applied to groups rather than individual ships. Escort commanders gained repeated experience operating under similar conditions, allowing institutional learning to accumulate. German submarines, by contrast, remained largely individual platforms operating within a centralized but rigid command structure. Tactical innovation at the submarine level was constrained by the need to conform to centrally directed operations. As the war progressed, both systems began to encounter stresses that exposed their vulnerabilities. For the Germans, radio communication emerged as a double-edged sword. Frequent transmissions were essential to coordinate Wolfpacks, but they also increased electromagnetic visibility. While German encryption remained secure, the mere act of transmitting allowed the Allies to detect signal direction and frequency. Over time, this created patterns that could be analyzed. Furthermore, centralized command introduced latency. Orders had to be transmitted, received, acknowledged, and executed across vast distances. In an environment where minutes mattered, this delay increasingly mattered. For the Allies, the primary vulnerability was coverage. Escorts were stretched thin, particularly in the mid-Atlantic. Aircraft could not yet patrol continuously over key routes. When convoys entered the air gap, they became dependent on surface escorts alone. Losses in these zones were often severe. This imbalance reached a critical point in 1942. With the United States' entry into the war, the operational environment expanded dramatically. American coastal waters were initially poorly defended, and German submarines exploited this weakness with devastating effect. Sinkings surged along the eastern seaboard and in the Caribbean. From a German perspective, this appeared to confirm the continued validity of the submarine strategy. Yet these successes masked a structural shift. The Allied system was beginning to integrate at a higher level. Command and control arrangements improved, particularly between British and American naval forces. Escort production increased, including vessels specifically designed for anti-submarine warfare. Long-range patrol aircraft began to close portions of the air gap. Most critically, intelligence analysis started to connect disparate data points into a coherent operational picture. The Battle of the Atlantic was no longer merely about sinking ships. It was becoming a contest over who could observe, interpret, and respond faster. The German Wolfpack system had been designed for an environment in which submarines could remain largely unseen until the moment of attack. As detection improved, even incrementally, that environment changed. Submarines forced to submerge lost speed, visibility, and tactical flexibility. Coordinated attacks became harder to execute as escorts disrupted concentration. At this stage, the system had not yet failed. German submarines continued to inflict heavy losses, and Allied shipping remained under severe strain. But the balance was shifting from a purely physical contest to a systemic one. The outcome would depend on whether either side could adapt its institutional assumptions faster than the other. The Wolfpack assumed that concentration would always outweigh detection. The Convoy system assumed that losses could be managed until defenses matured. Reality would soon test both beliefs. By early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic entered its decisive phase. The assumptions and systems described in the previous acts were no longer operating in isolation. They were colliding repeatedly, at scale, and under conditions neither side had originally designed for. What followed was not a sudden collapse, but a cumulative failure driven by compounding inaccuracies in German expectations and accelerating institutional adaptation on the Allied side. The critical variable was time. German submarine doctrine assumed that detection would occur late in the engagement cycle. A convoy would be sighted visually, reported, shadowed, and then attacked once sufficient force had concentrated. This sequence required hours, sometimes days, during which the initial contact submarine remained in proximity to the target. As Allied detection capabilities improved, this exposure window became increasingly dangerous. The first irreversible shift occurred in how convoys were found. Allied high-frequency direction finding, known colloquially as HFDF, began to compress the German decision timeline. Each radio transmission sent by a U-boat could be triangulated to generate a probable location. This did not require decrypting messages or understanding their content. It relied purely on physics and geometry. As Wolfpack coordination intensified, so did the volume of detectable transmissions. The result was a paradox. The very mechanism that enabled German concentration also revealed German presence. By mid-1942, Allied escorts were increasingly vectored towards submarines before an attack had even begun. Instead of reacting to torpedo strikes, escorts began initiating contact on suspected U-boat positions. Submarines were forced to submerge earlier and more frequently, losing the surface speed that made coordinated night attacks possible. This degradation mattered because submerged submarines were not merely slower, they were informationally blind. Periscopes offered narrow fields of view. Sonar detection risked counter-detection. Battery endurance imposed strict limits on maneuver. Every forced dive reduced tactical options. At the same time, Allied air coverage was expanding. Long-range patrol aircraft gradually closed the mid-Atlantic gap that had once been the Wolfpack sanctuary. Even intermittent air patrols altered submarine behavior. Aircraft did not need to sink submarines to be effective. Their presence alone forced U-boats to submerge, disrupting shadowing and delaying attacks. A convoy that could not be continuously tracked could not be reliably massed against. These effects were cumulative rather than dramatic. Sinkings continued. Convoys were still penetrated, but the efficiency curve was bending. The German response was to double down on concentration. Wolfpacks grew larger. Coordination became more centralized. Submarines were directed to patrol narrower areas to improve contact probability. Each of these measures increased radio traffic and reduced dispersion, further amplifying Allied detection advantages. This feedback loop reached a breaking point in the spring of 1943. During this period, convoy battles increasingly followed a similar pattern. A U-boat would make initial contact and transmit a report. Allied HF-DF stations would register the signal. Escorts would be redirected toward the suspected contact area. Aircraft, where available, would sweep ahead of the convoy. By the time additional submarines arrived, the convoy was already alert, escorts were maneuvering aggressively, and the submarines were operating under constant threat. Losses began to rise disproportionately on the German side. Submarines that lingered to attack faced coordinated countermeasures, depth charges, improved sonar tracking, and persistent pursuit. Even when submarines escaped immediate destruction, they were often driven off station, exhausted batteries, or suffered damage that forced withdrawal. The Wolfpack's fundamental promise, that mass could overwhelm defenses, was eroding because mass could no longer be achieved invisibly. At the same time, Allied convoy discipline improved. Escort groups became more standardized and professionalized. Instead of being tied rigidly to individual convoys, some escort formations were reorganized into hunter-killer groups capable of pursuing submarines aggressively beyond immediate convoy defense. This altered the geometry of engagement. Submarines were no longer merely repelled, they were hunted. This was a conceptual break with earlier doctrine. Previously, escorts prioritized staying close to the convoy, accepting that submarines might escape after an attack. Now the objective shifted toward attrition. Each submarine forced to withdraw, repair, or be destroyed reduced future threat capacity. The Atlantic was being made progressively less permissive. The turning point was not marked by a single battle but by a statistical inversion. In May 1943, German submarine losses spiked sharply. Dozens of U-boats were sunk in a single month, while Allied shipping losses declined. This reversal was not caused by a new wonder weapon or a sudden surge in escort numbers alone. It reflected the maturation of a system. German commanders still believed that tactical adjustments could restore effectiveness. New torpedoes were introduced. Defensive armament was increased. Orders emphasized caution and evasion. But these measures addressed symptoms, not causes. The underlying issue was informational asymmetry. Allied forces were beginning to see the ocean more clearly and earlier than German submarines could. Detection ranges expanded, reaction times shortened. Convoys no longer represented static targets but mobile, defended systems embedded within a broader surveillance network. The German command structure, optimized for centralized control, struggled to adapt. Orders lagged reality. Submarines received instructions based on outdated positions. Autonomy at the tactical level remained limited, constraining initiative precisely when flexibility was most needed. By the summer of 1943, the outcome was effectively irreversible. German submarine operations were curtailed. Patrol areas were reduced. Risk thresholds were raised. The Wolfpack doctrine, once the centerpiece of the Atlantic campaign, was no longer viable under prevailing conditions. It is at this point that the Battle of the Atlantic is often mischaracterized as having been won. In reality, what had occurred was a systemic failure on one side and a systemic consolidation on the other. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as compelling as we do, we'd be honored if you'd consider subscribing. These stories matter because they explain not just what happened, but why. The Allies had not eliminated the submarine threat. They had constrained it within a framework where losses could be absorbed and managed. German submarines still existed, but their operational freedom had been compressed to the point where strategic effect was no longer achievable. The Wolfpack had not been defeated in a single engagement. It had been rendered inefficient. This inefficiency, measured in delayed attacks, failed concentrations, rising losses, and diminishing returns, marked the collapse of the original German assumption. Submarines could still sink ships, but they could no longer decide the outcome of the war. The Atlantic had ceased to be a hunting ground. It had become a controlled environment. The consequences of the systemic failure described in Act III were not immediately visible at the strategic level. German submarines did not vanish from the Atlantic in 1943, nor did Allied shipping losses fall to zero. What changed was the direction of adaptation. From this point forward, the burden of adjustment fell almost entirely on Germany, while the Allies refined and expanded a system that already worked. This asymmetry shaped the remainder of the war. What German commanders did not yet fully understand was that the Atlantic contest had shifted from an exchange of losses to a contest of conversion. Allied industrial output could now be translated into usable combat power with increasing efficiency, while German interdiction efforts yielded diminishing returns. This transformation was decisive not because it destroyed German submarines outright, but because it removed their ability to impose strategic delay. Once convoy losses stabilized below replacement rates, the Atlantic ceased to be a limiting factor. This had immediate operational consequences. Britain's economy could function without existential pressure. Stockpiles of fuel, food, and raw materials grew rather than shrank. Shipyards no longer worked merely to replace losses but to expand capacity. Merchant fleets became larger, not smaller, despite ongoing sinkings. For the first time since 1939, Allied planners could assume continuity. This assumption underwrote every major operation that followed. The buildup of American forces in Britain, the sustained bombing campaign against Germany, and the eventual invasion of Western Europe all depended on uninterrupted maritime flow. None of these operations required a submarine-free ocean. They required a predictable one. German leadership attempted to respond. New submarine designs were proposed that emphasized underwater speed and endurance. Tactical directives emphasized caution, evasion, and dispersed patrols. Yet these adaptations faced two insurmountable constraints. First, they arrived too late to reverse the informational imbalance that now favored the Allies. Second, they were constrained by industrial realities. Germany could not field new systems faster than the Allies could counter them. The Atlantic system that had matured by 1943 was not static. It continued to improve. Escort carriers extended air cover even further. Sonar, radar, and weaponry improved incrementally. Command and control integration deepened, particularly between naval and air forces. Perhaps most importantly, training and doctrine became standardized across a growing coalition. Lessons learned in one sector were disseminated rapidly to others. This institutional learning created momentum. Each convoy passage reinforced procedures, validated assumptions, and generated data. Each successful defense reduced uncertainty. Over time, the system became resilient not because it was perfect, but because it absorbed friction without collapsing. German submarine operations, by contrast, became increasingly isolated. As losses mounted, patrol durations shortened. Experienced crews were lost faster than they could be replaced. Morale declined, not as an emotional factor, but as an operational one. Cautious commanders avoided risks that earlier doctrine had demanded. The Wolfpack concept, already compromised, became impractical as submarines struggled to assemble undetected. The full impact of this shift only became clear in retrospect. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a surrender ceremony or a decisive engagement. It ended when it stopped shaping strategic choices. Once Allied leaders could plan large-scale operations without factoring in catastrophic shipping losses, the Atlantic had been functionally secured. This outcome reframes the meaning of victory. The Allies did not win by annihilating German submarines. They won by changing the environment in which submarines operated. Detection, response, and coordination compressed the U-boat's decision space until effectiveness collapsed. The ocean did not become smaller, but it became observable. This distinction matters because it reveals the true lesson of the campaign. The decisive factor was not a weapon, a commander, or a tactic. It was the construction of a system that integrated sensors, communications, platforms, and institutions into a coherent whole. Each individual component, convoys, escorts, aircraft, intelligence, was insufficient on its own. Together, they altered the cost-benefit calculus of submarine warfare. Correction on the German side was not impossible in theory. It was impossible in practice because it required abandoning foundational assumptions mid-war. Decentralization, reduced reliance on radio communication, and acceptance of lower concentration would have undermined the very logic of the Wolfpack. Such changes conflicted with existing command culture and operational planning. By the time adaptation became unavoidable, the window for decisive impact had closed. The Battle of the Atlantic, therefore, stands as a case study in institutional lag. Early success reinforced flawed assumptions. By the time evidence accumulated to challenge those assumptions, sunk costs in doctrine, training, and production, limited flexibility. The Allies, operating from a position of initial vulnerability, adapted continuously because they had no alternative. This pattern extends beyond naval history. Modern military and institutional competitions are rarely decided by singular breakthroughs. They are decided by systems that shorten decision cycles, integrate information across domains, and reduce uncertainty faster than an adversary can respond. Environments that appear permissive can become hostile without dramatic confrontation, simply through incremental visibility and control. The Atlantic became decisive because it determined whether potential could become power. As long as the ocean remained dangerous, Allied industry was theoretical. Once it became manageable, that industry reshaped the war. Tanks, aircraft, fuel, and soldiers crossed the sea in numbers Germany could not interdict at scale. The Wolfpack did not fail because submarines stopped working. It failed because the system that enabled them stopped making sense. In that outcome lies the enduring lesson of the Battle of the Atlantic. Wars are not won by isolated successes, but by the ability to build, adapt, and sustain systems faster than an opponent can disrupt them. The ocean decided the war not by killing fleets, but by permitting movement. And once movement became reliable, the result was no longer in doubt.